Race and racism are unavoidable topics in America, including on the campaign trail. U.S. Senator Kamala Harris had a very candid, heartfelt, and blunt discussion on race and the painful role it has played in this country's past. It all started when a woman stood up and acknowledged her own family's history of hate and racism during a campaign event in South Carolina. The woman wanted to know how Harris would address the problem if she becomes president.
I'm embarrassed to say that my father was most likely in the KKK, and I grew up in the South as a daughter of the South, and I'm embarrassed at what I see with a lot of the Southerners and a lot of the members of our Congress, and the blatant racism of the Steve Kings and the Cindy Hyde Smiths and those people. It breaks my heart. And I'm wondering what you can do. This is probably a $6 million question for you, but what you can do to heal the racial divides that Donald Trump has emboldened, and also what we as white people who don't believe in that and don't support that, what can we do to help offset the obvious flashpoints of racial divide in this country.
Thank you for having the courage to stand and share your personal story. Part of the step that we must take to getting to the place that we know we can get and that we imagine and want to be where we want to be is we do have to speak the truths. Like you spoke a very difficult truth. And these truths must be acknowledged if we are to get to the place that we need to be. For too long, frankly, in our country, for too long, we have not had these honest discussions about race. We've just not. You can look at textbooks in public schools that have erased so much of the history, the awful, shameful history on race in this country. I'll give you an example just most recently in terms of my work in the United States Senate. I wrote a bill that we finally got out of the United States Senate and should get passed. Get this, brace yourself, to make lynching a federal crime. Thank you for the applause, but frankly, we are 200 years too late. Right? And having a conversation on the floor when I gave my speech and talking about, and this again, the brutality associated with this issue is something that, okay, maybe shouldn't be spoken in polite company. I hesitate to say what I said on the floor because I know there are young people here. But these realities must be spoken, and I spoke the reality that day in support of my bill, about how, in particular, black men were dragged from their homes, were dragged by car, by horse, were hung, in many cases castrated, in a violent crime with no evidence of any wrongdoing on their part, and never, rarely, any consequence for the people who committed the violent act on them. No justice for their families. For decades upon decades upon decades upon decades. And so this is one example of the point that you raised, and I thank you, which is when we have this conversation, it makes people really uncomfortable. But if we are going to get to a place where we move beyond the pain and all that is associated with it, we have to speak truth about what happened. And we have to do it understanding, and to the point of the spirit of you raising it and the way you did. It is in our collective best interest to speak these truths, to acknowledge what happened, to acknowledge then the vestiges of it that remain, because they do, to get to a place where we can heal and we can be better.
All right, provocative conversation. Back with me now, Wes Lowry, a national reporter for The Washington Post, and Julian Zelizer, who is a historian and professor at Princeton and a CNN political analyst. Good to see you both. All right, so Wes, let me begin with you. The question from the woman, asking about, how if you were elected president, will you heal the racial divide that Trump has emboldened? And, Kamala Harris, essentially saying that it begins with talking about the hard and ugly truths of all of, variety of injustices. So how dominant will this question be on the campaign trail that every candidate has to be prepared to be able to answer?
Certainly, I would expect every Democrat seeking the presidency to have to answer questions like this. In part, they would have had to answer some of these questions anyway. The Democratic Party is the racially and ethnically diverse party in our two-party system, right? There's always going to be divides and questions about how, if you want to be the leader or the face of that party, how you're going to manage those divides. But in this moment, right, where you're running against an incumbent president who was elected on a platform of kind of white racial grievance, who has a white ethnic coalition backing him, and who has pursued policies, be it the Muslim ban, be it the child separations at the border, who's made racially insensitive and clearly racist comments while he's been in office, there's going to be a real desire of Democratic voters to hear their candidate explain, one, with some moral clarity that those things were wrong, but two, how they might address them. And so I would expect every single candidate to face questions like this. I think Kamala Harris did a pretty impressive job there. It's going to be really interesting to see how different candidates grapple with this, right? Kamala Harris is someone who's might have to answer questions about her time as a prosecutor. Joe Biden, for example, is going to have to answer questions about his time leading Senate judiciaries. And so this is going to be an issue that comes up time and time again. Not only how do you currently articulate the racial divides in our country, but also how do you answer for your lifetime of work in public service one way or the other as it relates to these issues.
So Julian, we are talking about a very diverse Democratic field. How much of how a candidate tackles that issue could be make or break?
I think it's actually going to be essential. Often this is put aside as a secondary issue, but I think given where the country is right now and the way in which race has moved front and center, both with the reemergence of white nationalism at many levels of American society, and also at the ongoing issues of how race plays out in our institutions like the criminal justice system, this is part of what 220 is about. And I think the Democrats have an advantage, not just their electorate, but the actual field that's shaping up of candidates speaks to the answer of the person asking the questions. At this point, the Democratic Party is offering an answer through the candidates in terms of how we move to a different place. So I don't think it's something they can shy away from. I don't think they will in the end.
And so, Wes, do you see that, that burden or responsibility, however way you want to put it, will be on the shoulders of all of the Democratic candidates, or particularly is it going to be Kamala Harris or even, Cory Booker, particularly because they are people of color?
Well, look, I actually think this burden goes across all the candidates. It's going to be in the same way that I think that we earlier in the segment, or a different segment, we heard that Amy Klobuchar quote where she referenced how may the best woman candidate win, right? I think that if you were a male running for office right now, you might need to explain why in this moment you think you're the right standard bearer. In the same way, Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders does need to explain why they, an older white man who has spent decades in public life, is the right person in this moment to defeat Donald Trump, right? And I think that's a reasonable question, right? It's not just about checking boxes, but it's about, again, who the Democratic coalition is, what the priorities of that coalition are, and who is the face, who is the candidate to do this. And so while certainly it makes sense that naturally we ask candidates like Kamala Harris or Cory Booker these types of questions.
And even Julian Castro,
of course,
Tulsi Gabbard, also people of color, it seems as though, there may be a certain comfort level of asking them the questions, and perhaps their perspective will elicit a very different response from somebody who, is non-black, non-Latino, who is not a person of color. So the expectations might be a little different.
Yes, well, and their presence, I think, is going to force the other candidates to have to respond and engage in ways that's different, right? Having a debate stage with a black woman on it is different than having a debate stage without a black woman on it. Having a debate stage with Latino on it is different than a debate stage that does not have one.